Good day, everyone. Welcome to ICSS Sunday morning program at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library. My name is Sharon Rose, and I'm today's introducer. Alan is going to be the moderator later on for the discussion. ICSS stands for Institute for Critical Study of Society. We were formed at the Neville Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland in 2004 to preserve Marxist heritage, to support struggles for social justice, and struggle for socialism leading to communism. I can learn to understand. Sorry. I'm using the mouse with my left hand, and it's hard. The opinions expressed in our forum are only of its authors, but we all are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, who in his 11th thesis on Feuerbach said, "The philosophers have interpreted the world in different ways. The point, however, is to change it." For more than a year, we've been meeting remotely via the internet, and we are happy to be able to include people from around the US and around the world. Our local attendees have every intention to return to meeting at the library, but we intend to keep our virtual participants as well. Our format on Sunday mornings is for our speaker to present for about an hour and then an hour of discussion. At the end of the 2 hours, we turn off the recording and have about a half hour of more informal discussion. Our speaker today is Roger Keeran, who is an historian, a university professor, and the author, along with Thomas Kenny, of Socialism Betrayed: Beyond the Collapse of the Soviet Union, from International Publishers in 2004. Roger's book, The Communist Party and the Auto Workers' Unions, was originally published in 1980 and was long out of print. International Publishers recently republished it. And I'd like to just read you a little bit from the publisher's website as a framework for Roger's talk today. The history of communists and American labor raises three questions. Were the communists legitimate or good trade unionists? Were they an important influence in the labor movement? Were they good communists? These questions involve matters that go beyond the history of communists in the auto industry. Consequently, this work does not provide the last word on them. Yet, raising these questions has a point. It enables the expression of views on these questions that differ from others that have been written about communists and labor, and what assumptions lie behind this work. Finally, this book refutes some commonly held ideas about communists and labor. The introduction also discusses several problems of method, the identification of communists, and the reliability of communist sources and oral history. So with that, I'd like to turn the program over to Roger Keeran. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And thank you all for this invitation. Can you all hear me all right? If not, just wave your hands. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of my comrades from ML Today, Rick and Walter and Joe Jameson. That's really beyond the call of duty to come to my Zoom after listening to me at our editorial meetings as well. So anyway, thank you, though. I really appreciate it. Today, I'll follow the format that Sharon just suggested, maybe with just a little alteration. After teaching all my life, I determined that people's consciousness starts to flag pretty seriously after about 45 minutes. So maybe I'll try to shorten this presentation a little bit to about 45 minutes. And if I don't cover all the points in the presentation that I wanted to, maybe I can bring out some of them in the discussion. So what I'd like to do is just start again briefly where Sharon left off with a little bit of the publication history of this book. And then, I have this kind of obsession. I can't repeat myself. So I'm not just going to summarize the book. I prepared a presentation just for you guys. So I want to start then by putting the history of communists and labor in kind of the larger context of labor history. And then again, instead of trying to summarize my book point by point, the book is now available for anybody who wants to read it. I thought maybe I'd just tell you 3 stories from the book that I think illustrate the larger points I'm trying to make. So let's begin with just a brief history of the publication of this book. This book started out as a dissertation, as many scholarly books do, and then was published in 1980 by Indiana University Press while I was a professor at Cornell University. At the time of its publication, it was pretty controversial in the sense that it was the only scholarly book on the communists and the labor movement that presented the communists in a favorable light, that argued that they made a positive contribution. Every other scholarly book out there was written by conservatives, by liberals, by social democrats, by Trotskyists, etc. The only favorable treatment you could find of the communist and labor movement were by communists themselves, basically, at this point. Memoirs like by Mortimer or Williamson and from Ohio, and Foster's books, Boyer and Moray, etc. So when this book was published, a scholarly book taking a favorable view of the communist contributions, that was quite controversial, not too popular among my colleagues at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, some of whom I criticized by name in the book. Anyway, after this, the book was published by international publishers a few years later. And then when International fell on hard times, the book was out of print for over 20 years. And a few months ago, my comrade Walter Tillow was in touch with an organizer of a major union. And he said that he had some young socialist organizers that he was working with, members of DSA and others throughout the country, and they were really hungry to know about the experience of the left, particularly the communists and the labor movement. And was there any way we could get my book republished? So we raised some money, we had the book scanned, and International agreed under these circumstances to republish it. So it was just available again after being unavailable for 20 or 30 years. Now, let me, if you will permit me, I mean, this might be telling you stuff you already know, but put what I'm going to tell you about the history of communists and auto workers in the kind of larger context of labor history, to kind of let you know kind of the assumptions I was working with and kind of what's on my mind. I mean, I think the major assumption, if you will, behind my book, it's not stated in the book, but kind of the assumption that drove me was Marx saying that we, meaning we socialists, we communists, know only one single science, the science of history. And as a young leftist, that's what motivated me to look into this history, this sense that if we're going to make socialism in this country, if we're going to make a socialist revolution, we have to have the majority of workers with us. The majority of people in this country are workers. And we have to learn from what we did in the past that was successful, as well as those things that weren't successful. And it only takes a little acquaintance with labor history to realize that the most successful experience of American labor occurred in the 1930s and early 1940s. And I just give you a couple of indications of this. I mean, there are two strong indications of where the working class is at any point in history, and that's the density of union membership, I mean, the number of union members, and the number of strikes. Because when workers join unions, when they go on strike, this is an indication, in Marx's words, that they're becoming a class not just in itself, that is, a class defined by being exploited, but they're becoming a class for itself, a class that realizes that it shares interests with other members of that class and that their interests are opposed to those of the capitalists, of the employer. So union membership and strike activity is a strong indication of worker consciousness then. And that consciousness, it seems to me, was at its peak then in the 1930s and 1940s when you look at these indications. Take union density for a minute, union membership. Union membership today is about 11%. About 11% of the workers are in unions. That's almost exactly what it was 100 years ago, in 1921. In fact, you could say that the things are even worse today because that 11% in 1921 was mainly workers in private industry. The 11% today represents public and private. Only about 7% of the workers in private industry are organized. This other indication of strike activity. Now, the government did not keep track of strikes in the 1930s and early 1940s, but there were other people who did try to keep track of it. And if you look at the number of strikes that occurred in the 1930s, you're talking about 1,500 strikes a year in the mid-30s, 1,800 strikes a year in the late 30s. A lot of strike activity. The Government Bureau of Labor Statistics started recording the number of strikes of 1,000 or more workers in the late 1940s. Once you look at these government statistics, something very striking is obvious. The number of workers going on strike drops precipitously and steadily from the late 1940s until today, just as the union density peaks about 1955, about 30%, and continues to decline to 11% today. So strike activities also decline. In the 1950s, you had maybe an average of 350 strikes a year. In the 1960s, an average of maybe 250 strikes a year. Do you know how many strikes occur these days? Do you know how many strikes have occurred in the last 20 years on average? 15. 15 strikes a year. Again, compared to the 1930s, 1,500 strikes a year. It's just like a kind of a graphic illustration of where working class consciousness is at. Now, I would argue, and this is that what determined that rise in union density and rise in union strikes in the 1930s and early 1940s had a great deal to do with communist activity in the labor movement. Now, of course, we're talking about a complex phenomenon. There are many things that go into it. There was the Depression, of course, but I would argue that the key decisive factor was the presence of communists in the labor movement. And that's what the importance, I think, of looking at the detailed history of communists and the auto workers is all about, because it demonstrates that argument. So let's take a look for a second. First, a broad look and then a closer look at communists in the auto industry. Again, I think a very kind of striking way to look at it is to begin, broad and then kind of zero in. But again, kind of if you compare the auto industry and indeed industry in general in 1931 and the auto industry and industry in general in 1941, you see what we're talking about here. The auto industry in 1931. Of course, we're in the middle of the Depression, but still the auto industry represents the largest concentration of industrial workers in the country. The largest capitalist firms, General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, etc. Just an example, the Ford Motor Company, a couple of years before 1931, had just completed the River Rouge plant outside Detroit, over 1 mile square industrial complex with 90 buildings and eventually 80,000 workers working there. A company that took raw steel and iron in at one end and produced finished cars at the other end, as the Diego Rivera mural in Detroit so graphically shows. Of course, these workers had no unions, no contracts, no guaranteed wages, no protection from arbitrary treatment, no seniority, no sick days, no vacations, no pensions, no unemployment insurance. This was the way people lived in the auto industry in 1931. And of course, with the onset of the Depression in 1929, employment was slashed and wages were slashed. Now in this, the auto workers simply mirrored what was going on in other industries as well. The 11% of the workers that were organized in 1931 were mainly craft workers, that is, workers that had a skill, mainly in the construction industry, iron molders and plumbers and carpenters, etc. Whereas the mainly white workers, native-born workers, workers in auto were largely unskilled. There were some skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, and native-born, Black, recent immigrants, etc. Now, in 1931, in spite of this situation, the leaders of the labor movement, William Green, president of the AFL, Matthew Wohl, secretary-treasurer of the AFL, actually opposed organizing industrial workers. I mean, hard to believe, but yeah, they thought industrial workers have no skill, they have no leverage, they can't be organized, they're a bunch of bohunks, ignorant, and you can't organize them. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. Also, Green thought that it was impossible to struggle against the conditions of the Depression, that it made no sense to try to strike against wage cuts, and made no sense to argue for unemployment insurance. That unemployment insurance actually would be a disaster for workers. It would sap their character. It was a dole. And that anyway, you couldn't blame the capitalists for this depression. The depression was caused mainly by Soviet dumping. So this was the ideology, 1931. They as I said, Green and Wohl opposed strikes and thought that the way forward was through labor management cooperation, that the union would grow by convincing the employer that they would actually make more profits if they recognized a conservative union like the AFL. That got them nowhere, by the way. Now, if you look again at the situation in auto 10 years later, and the situation in industry generally 10 years later, you see a sea change, an absolute sea change. Not only in terms of unionization, but in terms of worker politics. All of the major corporations in the auto industry, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, Kelsey Hayes, Briggs, etc., were all organized by 1941. They all had contracts with job and wage protections, with seniority, with overtime pay, the steward and grievance system, and so forth, as well as protection against at least the most extreme forms of racial and sexual discrimination. And other industries likewise developed their own unions, achieved their own contracts in this same period. And the unions became actively engaged in politics, whereas they hadn't been actively engaged in politics in 1931. By 1941, through the support of the labor support, CIO support of the Democratic Party, unions had gained, of course, the right to organize, the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security through the Social Security Act, unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, etc. So how did this come about? I mean, just to ask the question rhetorically, I think the point that I would make, and that I will try to illustrate by looking a little more closely at the auto industry, is that, of course, that there's no simple explanation, but that this did not occur spontaneously. Of course, in the background was the Depression, which caused 17 million people to be unemployed and wage cuts for the rest. But, and there's nothing, like an economic depression, except maybe a war, for shaking up the way people live and the way people think. But even with the Depression, I would argue that the changes that happened did not happen spontaneously, that they did not occur because the capitalists suddenly decided, even because of the Depression, that they could live with unions. They did not occur because the AFL suddenly decided, yes, we want to organize industrial workers and we believe in strikes. No, it did not even happen because the leaders of the Democratic Party, like Roosevelt, suddenly thought that workers deserved a right to organize. Remember, as late as 1937, Memorial Day, 1937, the Chicago police, acting for the steel industry, shot 10 workers in the back in Chicago in the Memorial Day massacre who were trying to organize. 1937, on an overpass outside the Ford Motor Company, the Ford goons beat up union organizers, including Walter Reuther. So this late in the game, the corporations were not willing to recognize unions. And certainly it did not come about because of Roosevelt either. Remember, 1935, this is already 3 years into the New Deal, Roosevelt still opposed giving workers the right to organize. The National Labor Relations Act was passed without Roosevelt's support. He reluctantly signed it. And then in 1937, Roosevelt, our most liberal president, then or since, I suppose, famously said during a steel strike, a plague on both their houses, a plague on both labor and the corporations. Well, this is not a ringing endorsement of unionism as late as 1937. And even the CIO, which had formed in 1935 to support industrial unions, they did support industrial unions, but they did not support strikes. The leaders of the CIO continued to, like the AFL leaders, to support labor management cooperation. So what I would argue is that these ideas did not come about spontaneously. They were suddenly adopted by the elites of the corporations or the Democratic Party or the labor movement. These ideas came from the bottom. They came from a grassroots movement, more often than not, whose ideas were provided by the Communist Party, whose leadership was provided by the Communist Party, whose struggles were led by the Communist Party. And that what the experience in the auto industry points out, I think, in the 1930s, is how what this idea of communist idea of a militant minority, how a minority of workers, guided by Marx, And the understanding of dialectical materialism can then address the immediate needs of workers in a way that extends their influence far beyond their relatively small numbers. And of course, there are other things besides just this that went into the communist success, namely the diligence, the intelligence, the courage, the toughness of those individuals themselves. But this idea of applying Marxism to the immediate positions and supporting this idea of a class struggle unionism, the communists had the field alone here. And it was they're the ones who gave this who account for this change from 1931 to 1941. Now, I said the beauty of the communist experience in auto is it provides a wonderful case study of exactly what we're talking about. A perfect example of the communist role. And in many ways, the communist experience in auto provided an inspiration and even example, a model for communists elsewhere in the country. And as we'll see, provided the main breakthroughs that aided other workers in organizing. Now, I'm not going to try to summarize that whole history. I mean, I wrote a book on it. Fortunately, the book's now available. So if you're interested in the details, of course, you can pick up the book. But I thought what I'd do today is just tell you 3 stories about the auto workers organizing that I think illustrate this larger point that I just made. The first story has to do with the Auto Workers Union. This is the Auto Workers Union. It's not the United Automobile Workers, UAW. Auto Workers Union, probably most of you have never heard of. But from the early 1920s until the foundation of the UAW in 1935, there was only one real union in the auto industry, and that was the Auto Workers Union. The Auto Workers Union in the early 1920s was a union led by socialists. And then in 1925, a young communist by the name of Phil Raymond moved to Detroit. Actually, maybe even was sent to Detroit by the party to join the auto workers. He took a job with the Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company, worked there for a year, became active in this socialist-led union, and 1 year later, in 1926, the union elected him as the president. So from 1926 through 1934, the AWU was the only real union in the auto industry outside of another union of tool and die makers. And this was a communist-led union, led by Raymond and his comrades, and an independent union, not part of the AFL, but eventually part of the Trade Union Unity League, which is the communist federation set up to counter the AFL. Now, the AWU, the Auto Workers Union, was never really very successful, frankly. I mean, if you looked at objective account of it, it never won any strikes. In fact, it never called any strikes. It never signed any agreements. It never had any recognition from the employers. It never had a vast membership. At most, maybe over 1,000 workers were members, and it never claimed to represent more than 10,000 workers at any time, and that its peak was 1929, just before the Depression hit. Still, it would be a mistake, I think, a simplistic mistake to think just because this union didn't have much success that it was unimportant. I think it had a great importance because this union, together acting with the communists in shop clubs and acting together with communists in left-wing fraternal organizations, had a certain ideological influence on the development of auto workers. first, in terms of industrial unionism, this idea of industrial unionism. Now, of course, the idea seems simplistically true, and clear and compelling. That is the idea that if you're going to have a union of auto workers in this diverse industry, skilled and unskilled workers, you have to organize everybody who works in a plant and not simply organize those skilled workers. That seems so trivially obvious. You wonder, who could possibly have opposed this? But of course, the AFL did oppose it, and they opposed trying to organize these craft workers. They thought they were impossible to organize, and so even though the logic was there, it was the communists who articulated that logic and who defended this position and tried to publicize this idea that what workers need in auto is an industrial union that embraces everybody. And regardless of skill, but also regardless of whether you're white or black or a man or a woman. Again, this idea was promulgated out there in their newspapers and their communist shop papers. Every shop that had a communist club in it put out a little newspaper. The Fisher Body Worker, the Spark Plug, the Ford Worker, etc. These were little mimeographed newspapers that came out sporadically, usually with news from the workers themselves, although written by communists not employed in the plants, and then distributed surreptitiously in the plants. But these papers and the auto worker news drove home these ideas of industrial unionism, fighting discrimination, promoting equality, etc., etc. The same was true of this idea of class struggle unionism. Again, it may seem simplistically obvious that this is the kind of unionism auto workers need, that the companies are not going to concede anything without a struggle. That was the basic idea of class struggle unionism. You've got to struggle, and particularly you've got to be willing to strike if you're going to wring any concessions from these employers. And yet, though, and obviously the logic of this, proved itself eventually. When unionism came to the auto industry, it only came as a result of some of the most dramatic and serious class struggle strikes that had ever occurred in American history. But in the early 1930s, in spite of the reality, the ideology of the AFL opposed this class struggle approach. Again, they took the approach that workers they could gain from unions, that unions could increase their membership by promoting labor management cooperation, by going to the employers and saying, if you recognize our unions, first of all, we'll keep the communists out, and secondly, you will increase your profitability, etc. This never worked. I don't know of a single instance where an employer signed in with an AFL union because they bought this logic. However, the AWU showed that this logic made sense, and the communists in the Auto Workers Union never had enough size and authority to call their own strikes. But what they did, besides putting out these newspapers and calling meetings, is that when strikes spontaneously occurred, and they often did occur in the auto industry, something would happen, somebody would be fired, somebody would be hurt, wages would be cut, then the workers would spontaneously drop their tools and walk out. When this happened and the communists learned of it, they would immediately go to these strikers, try to help them organize, formulate their demands, get them outside support, etc., help them with their strikes. Now, one of the most dramatic instances of this occurred in 1933. In January 1933, the Briggs Company was an auto body company, one of the most oppressive places to work in Detroit. And the Briggs Company, which had about 10,000 workers, not a small company, in several different plants, cut wages by 20%. Now, the communists had a couple of few members in the Briggs plants. They'd held some meetings, but the workers walked out on their own. It was a spontaneous walkout. But Raymond and his colleagues, comrades, showed up at the strike, started giving advice, helped them organize a strike committee. Raymond himself, though he wasn't a worker there, the workers elected him to lead the strike. They formulated demands. They called upon the unemployed not to cross the picket lines. They got food and other support from outside the plant, etc. And eventually, lo and behold, without a union, without previous roots in the plant, the strikers won. Briggs rescinded its 20% wage cut. And according to one commentator in Detroit at the time, the orgy of wage cutting in Detroit came to an end, at least for the time being there. But the point is that the AWU and the communists showed in 1933, in the height of the Depression, with 17 million people unemployed, that you could actually go on strike against a wage cut and win. It was something that, well, astounded everybody, and certainly contradicted what the AFL was saying. And sometimes this communist influence was directly traceable to what happened later. That is, I think it's very interesting to know when you continue studying this history. You come up to the General Motors sit-down strike of 1937, 36-37, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And you see in the key sit-down plant, Fisher Body 1 in Flint, that the rank and file leaders of that plant, Bud Simons, Joe Divot, Green, Jay Green, and forget the other guy's name right now, but the four of them had all been members of the AWU. They had all had experience in the Communist Union in the early 1930s and had been affected by this idea of class struggle unionism. And here now, during the sit-down strike of 1936-37, they were able to put these ideas into practice and to help lead and win this strike. Now, there was one other place, I think, that this AWU had an impact in spite of its lack of obvious success. Another ideological impact, and that was on the notion of racial equality and sexual equality, but I'll talk mainly about racial equality here. That is, the AWU and the communists in general always argued that the union must fight against discrimination in the industry, particularly racial discrimination. Now, from the perspective of today, this may seem so ordinary, it's not worth mentioning. You know, I mean, who would not oppose racial discrimination? But this was not the normal in Detroit in the 1930s. Racial discrimination in the auto plants was ubiquitous. Some companies simply refused to hire blacks at all. And if other companies did hire blacks, like Ford, they gave them the worst jobs. They were all put in the foundries, dangerous jobs, or janitorial jobs. So, and nobody objected. Nobody objected. The government didn't object. The AFL didn't object. Even black leaders in Detroit didn't object. Church leaders, ministers, because Ford had bought them off. Ford made contributions to the black churches, and they in turn supported him. So nobody was raising this question of equality and racial discrimination except the communists. Again, it may seem common sense that if you're going to try to organize industrial workers, you've got to organize blacks and whites and immigrants and native born and men and women. But as someone once said, common sense is not so common. And it certainly wasn't common on this question in the 1930s. The Socialist Party, for example, who had headed the AWU until 1926, opposed making any special appeals to Black workers or engaging in any special struggles against racial discrimination. Why? Because they believed that the approach was what they called colorblind. You had to treat all workers on a class basis, make no exceptions, and thus no special appeals to Black workers, no special fights against racial discrimination. Of course, this simply ignored the fact that while all workers suffered low wages and insecurity and arbitrary treatment, Black workers suffered in a way that white workers didn't. And this so-called colorblind approach did not prevent the socialists from printing racial jokes in their AWU newspaper, did not prevent them from using the N-word, did not prevent them from portraying Blacks in racial stereotypes. Yeah, so much for colorblindness. Well, when Raymond took over the union in 1926, all of this came to a stop. There were no more racial jokes, no more N-words, and instead, this consistent, repeated appeal that the union welcomed all workers, white or Black, would promote Blacks to leadership, and would fight against racial discrimination in the industry. Again, many years later, I read the memoirs of a guy named Frank Marquardt, who was a non-communist, maybe a socialist. He became education director for one of the major locals, UAW locals in Detroit. And he said in his memoir that he never became aware, never had any awareness at all of the special discrimination of Black workers until he learned it through the Auto Workers Union. And he said, learning this forever changed his life. So again, this is the kind of contribution, ideological contributions that the AWU was making. Okay, how am I doing on time? Well, as usual, kind of best intentions here. I was going to stop under 45 minutes, but let me go on. If you're not falling asleep, I don't see anybody nodding off yet. So let me tell you just a quick second story about communists in the auto industry that I think is quite illuminating. And this is the struggle for an independent industrial union. Now, let's jump ahead. If you jump ahead to 1934, 35, 33, 34 in the industry, the Auto Workers Union was kind of surpassed by spontaneous organization that was occurring many places in the Auto Workers Union. Workers were forming independent unions. They were forming unions on their own. In many cases, these took the form of independent unions having nothing to do with the AFL, but in some cases, many cases, workers formed unions and were granted these charters by the AFL called Federal Labor Union Charters, FLUs. And the idea was the AFL said, okay, we'll give you a charter for these industrial unions. You can organize everybody, but eventually we're going to divide you up into craft unions because, basically we don't believe in industrial unions. So these FLUs are just temporary. Well, except for many workers, this became a taste of what a real union, industrial union, should be about. And one of these workers was a guy named Wyndham Mortimer, a middle-aged auto worker at White Motor in Cleveland, who'd worked in the auto industry for 20 years, who'd organized the White Motor Company, and built it into a federal labor union. And Mortimer realized the potential of these FLUs as well as these other independent unions, and he began reaching out to them. And between late 1933 and 1934 and early 35, Mortimer organized, a communist, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned that, but organized a series of national meetings that brought together these independent unions and these FLU representatives for one purpose, demanding that the AFL grant these federal labor unions and the independents, if they would join, a charter, an industrial union charter. And these conferences, there were 3 or 4 or 5 of them, grew larger and larger. The pressure grew greater. And eventually, Green agreed to give the FLU their own charter in 1935. He granted an industrial union charter to the Auto Workers Union, United Automobile Workers Union, but he still refused to allow them to elect their own officers and develop their own program. He didn't trust them that much. So that took another year. And then in 1936, the union, UAW, held its first independent convention, and everybody admits that the natural choice for a president was Wyndham Mortimer. He was tremendously popular, tremendously effective, tremendously respected, but he was a communist. That was one little problem there. So they decided instead to elect a former Baptist minister by the name of Homer Martin president. And Mortimer went along with this because many of the workers in the industry were from the South. And plus, Martin represented one of these independent unions. So they thought, this is the best way to build a union, is not to put Mortimer at the head, but to put Homer Martin at the head. But in any case, it was Mortimer, a communist, and his friends who led this fight to get an industrial union charter. All right, let me end then with one final story, and that's on the General Motors sit-down strike itself. This is the story about how 2 communists, Wyndham Mortimer and Bob Travis, led a 44-day sit-down strike against the most powerful industrial corporation in the world, General Motors, and won. To my mind, this is the most dramatic, the most important, the most consequential working class struggle in American history. There should be massive books and articles written on this, studying it, drawing out its lessons. In fact, this is not the case. There are only 2 books that deal with the General Motors sit-down strike. One was by Henry Krauss, who was a communist who put out the Union newspaper. He wrote this shortly after the strike. The other was by an academic historian from the University of Michigan, Sidney Fine. And he did a very workmanlike work on the sit-down strike, although his main purpose seemed to be to to diminish the importance of the left and point out the importance of democratic leaders like the governor of Michigan and Roosevelt, etc. In any case, I would say if you're interested in this history, if you want to read about the most dramatic struggle ever in American history, American labor history anyway, I would say, you don't want to immerse yourself in the whole thing. Just read the sit-down chapter of my book. I mean, it'll give you the essence. And of course, like any social phenomenon, strike, revolution, or whatever, many things went into determining the outcome of the General Motors sit-down strike. There were many personalities. Socialists were involved, ex-Wobblies were involved, Democrats, traditional trade union leaders, and of course, the rank and file workers themselves. But yet I would argue that if you look at this history closely, it was the influence of communists at crucial moments in this strike that determined the outcome. And I say this not relying, by the way, on the testimony of communists. Actually, in truth, communists who were involved in the strike and communists afterwards were extremely modest about what their role was. They were trying to build unity and not brag about what they were doing. So it doesn't come from the braggadocio of communists themselves, but it actually comes from looking very closely on how that strike developed and at what other non-communists were saying about the way they operated. Now, first had to do with the preparation of the strike. Like I said, 1936, General Motors was the largest, most politically influential, profitable industrial capitalist corporation in the world. It had tremendous power. It employed over 200,000 people and 69 auto plants in 35 different cities. And Flint, Michigan alone, which was the center of the General Motors empire, they employed 47,000 people in Flint, Michigan. 2 out of every 3 people who worked in Flint, Michigan worked for General Motors. They controlled the politics of Flint. The mayor, the city manager, the chief of police had all been General Motors employees. The Flint Journal was, the newspaper was completely in the pocket of General Motors. And in the 2 years before Mortimer got there, Mortimer went immediately after he was selected to lead this organizing drive in 1936. In the 2 years before Mortimer got there, General Motors had spent over $800,000 on spies and espionage and private security agencies to keep the Union out. The 1936 UAW convention, by the way, adopted this class struggle approach that the AW and communists were arguing for, and which even the CIO opposed at this point. That is, in 1936, the union called for a general strike in auto to take place in 1937, and that they would start organizing for it, and they chose Mortimer to lead this campaign. Mortimer then moved to Flint, and as soon as he moved to Flint, he discovered what he was up against. It's amazing to me. I still can't get my mind around that he managed to be successful at all. As soon as he moved to Detroit in the Dresden Hotel, he discovered his phone was tapped. He was followed every place he went. He was threatened to get out of town immediately or be carried out in a box. He looked at the union that existed in Flint at the time. There were 5 little locals with a total of 122 members. 47,000 people were in the industry at that time. He had a treasury of $24. No workers wanted to associate with this union. They thought it was all filled with spies anyway, and rats. And he found that he could. How was he going to contact the workers? The authorities refused to allow him permission to hand out leaflets at the plant gates. He could not hold open meetings because they were all infiltrated with spies. So he creatively came up with ideas to reach the auto workers. He used old membership lists, he used the city director, and he compiled a list of 5,000 names of auto workers, and he began sending them letters. 10 brilliant letters, really, really brilliant letters, arguing for why they should join the union, why they can trust this union, why this union is different than what they were used to, what they'd experienced before, how their lives would change, how they could not go on living the same way, it wasn't worth the risk, et cetera, et cetera. Brilliant letters. And arguing for this class-conscious unionism, arguing that there should be no discrimination from race or politics either. He said it should be possible in this industry to hold an opinion since the Renaissance without being called a communist, et cetera. And he did something else. He relied on the 100 or so communists that were members of the party in Flint, as well as members of these left-wing fraternal organizations, to start holding secret meetings. Often these meetings were held in basements with one candle, and which he would make this appeal for auto unionship, and gradually grew this membership. He faced obstacles not only from the corporation, but from the union itself. Some of his colleagues said he was trying to build a red empire in Flint. I demanded that he be removed. Mortimer was such a great guy. He said, look, to keep peace in the family, I'm going to step down. But let me appoint my successor. And he appointed Bob Travis, another communist who had worked for 10 years in the auto industry in Toledo. And Travis proved to be an immensely charismatic and resourceful and courageous leader who then led the strike to its conclusion. Anyway, the strike, I'm going to jump ahead, finally occurred in December 28th, 1936. It started. Here it's important to note that one key piece of intelligence that Wyndham Mortimer gathered was from a communist tool and die maker named John Anderson. And Anderson informed him that the key dies for the entire General Motors empire were made in two plants, Fisher Body 1 in Flint and Fisher Body in Cleveland. And if he could shut down those two plants, he could paralyze the whole General Motors empire. And so that's where Mortimer and Travis concentrated. And by December 28th, Cleveland, Fisher Body went on strike. 2 days later, Travis brought the strike to the Fisher Body number 1 plant, a sit-down strike. Now, did this idea of a sit-down strike, that is staying in the plants, was this a communist idea? Well, I don't think it was a communist idea. It was around. It's true, CGT, the Communist Union in France, employed this tactic in 1936, but other people had employed it as well, including in the auto industry in 1936. The idea was around. But what is clear is from the testimony of many auto workers is that the idea was brought to the auto industry by the communists. They popularized this idea as early as November 1936. Bud Simons and the other communists in Fisher Body 1 were meeting with Bob Travis about this idea of striking and staying in the plants. And the idea obviously had a certain appeal because it meant that the employer could not bring in scabs so easily. And the employer would think twice about using violence against the workers, excuse me, because of all this expensive equipment. But it also posed tremendous challenges in terms of organizing and feeding the workers who stayed in the plant. Let me just say this about the organization of this strike. In 1919, William Z. Foster led the most important industrial strike before the General Motors strike. This is the 1919 steel strike. That strike failed, but after that strike, he wrote a series of articles and books teasing out the lessons of that strike and how you had to organize to be successful. I would say that what Foster wrote became the playbook for the leaders of the General Motors sit-down strike. You can look at what Foster said and look at what they did, and it's like a one-to-one correlation. I mean, without going into all the details, they organized a broad strike committee to lead the strike, to make decisions, a 17-member strike committee. Everybody in the plant was on a committee. The committees were in charge of security, of defense, of feeding people, of providing a post office, of entertaining people, of educating people, of providing athletics. They even set up a kangaroo court to enforce discipline in the strike, although it was mainly done kind of tongue-in-cheek and done for entertainment purposes. And outside also, they brought in their resources. Henry Krause, a communist from Cleveland who'd worked with Mortimer, became in charge of publicity. His wife, Dorothy Krause, set up a kitchen to feed the strikers, sometimes feeding 5,000 people a day. She brought in a cook, a famous chef from the Detroit Athletic Club to cook for the strikers. They organized plays that took place outside the plant to entertain the workers, et cetera, et cetera. It was an organizational phenomenon. But besides this organization, and here I'll end with just there were two moments in the strike that were absolutely decisive, it seemed to me, as to which way things were going to go. One was early on in the strike, the corporation went and got an injunction from a Judge Black. And the injunction called for the workers to evacuate the plants immediately. Martin, the head of the union, said, yes, we have to follow this. His attorney, a socialist attorney, Larry Davidoff, said, there's nothing to do, but, you got to obey an injunction. Travis said, no, we're not going to obey. We're going to fight. And they had two communist lawyers working with them. One was Lee Pressman, who has recently been a communist in the agricultural department. And he had friends in New York, and they found out that Judge Black owned over 3,000 shares of General Motors stock. Well, they publicized this egregious conflict of interest, and the injunction became a dead letter, and the strike continued. A second decisive moment in the strike, if you will, occurred in what was called after the Battle of Bull's Run. That is, about 3 weeks into the strike, General Motors security people tried to evict the strikers from Fisher Body 2, and a battle occurred in the streets, led by Travis, who, by the way, was injured and subsequently arrested. But they succeeded in driving off the security forces, and the strike continued. But after that, that battle in the streets, General Motors finally agreed to mediation with the governor, Frank Murphy of Michigan. And out of this came an agreement, which Martin agreed to, which was that General Motors would start talking to the union after the union evacuated the plants. Well, Travis and other, leaders on the ground were outraged by this. Why should they give up their leverage in the plants for just the promise of being talked to? And Travis became convinced that there had to be some dramatic move that would show that the strike was still active and still alive, get it off this defensive posture. So he came up with this idea of seizing the largest plant that was still operating in Flint, Chevrolet 4, in which the union had very little support. But he came up with an absolutely ingenious plan on how to do this. He thought they would try to deceive General Motors into thinking that they were going to seize Chevrolet plant number 9, which is 200 yards away from Chevrolet plant number 4. And so through this elaborate scheme, they got spies and others to carry this information back to the General Motors, and General Motors subsequently moved their security people from plant number 4 to plant number 9. But the real plot, so to speak, the real plan, the real scheme all along was to seize Chevrolet plant number 4. And so using activists from plant number 2 and from outside the plant, they managed to seize Chevrolet plant number 4, the largest plant still operating in Flint. And it was a tremendous and surprising victory. And 2 days after that, General Motors decided to negotiate with the union without demanding that they leave the plant. And several days later, on February 11th, the union successfully concluded an agreement. With this agreement, union membership jumped from 80,000 in 6 months to 400,000. The next day, 18 sit-down strikes broke out in Detroit. In the next year, over 400 sit-down strikes occurred during the country. And most interestingly of all, right after the General Motors strike, U.S. Steel decided to sign a contract with the United Steelworkers Union. And Thomas Lamont, who worked for U.S. Steel, subsequently wrote that the reason this occurred was that Myron Taylor, the head of U.S. Steel, decided that if General Motors could not resist the union, neither could the Steel Workers Corporation. That if a strike occurred at Steel, it would cost millions of dollars, and in the words of Myron Taylor, quote, might prove such a major crisis as to constitute almost a social revolution. So with that, the dominoes started to fall, and industry after industry decided that they could not stand up either, and they agreed to a unionization. And this then is the story of the importance, I think, of the Communist Party in the 1930s and the auto industry. Now, of course, it's not the end of the story. The end of the story is more tragic, and it has to do with how the results of the Cold War and McCarthyism drove the communists out of the auto industry and out of most other industries as well. And but therein lies the tale of why class consciousness, union membership, and union strikes have fallen since then, it seems to me. I thank you very much for your patience and your attention, even though I went well over my intended deadline.
It's a great presentation, Roger. What we're going to be doing now is, in a few minutes, we're going to open up for questions and answers and comments. So I'd ask everybody, if you have questions or comments you'd like to make about the presentation, please take a look at either the reactions button at the bottom of your screen or the participants window. Raise your hand. We will generally take people in the order in which they raise their hands for these questions and give Roger a chance to respond. Before we do that, we have a couple of quick announcements for upcoming sessions. Want to call your attention to the next two sessions that are coming up. We've got some really great, interesting, and exciting presentations coming up. The first one is going to be a presentation, an unusual presentation on a film that it has been made by a group of Indian filmmakers who toured the Midwest and are going to talk about interviewing farmers about the changes in the agriculture and the destruction of family farms, small farms, and relating it to the farmer struggles that are going on right now in India. And actually, Amit Singh, if you would please unmute yourself and just say a few words about the film and next week's session, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alan. Am I audible, Alan?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Professor Keeran, for presenting a wonderful talk. So next week, Dr. Vedbrata Payne, who is an ex-NASA scientist, already living in the US for a number of years. What he did was quite fascinating. He toured 10,000 kilometers through the Midwest of rural America. And what he found was really astounding. Most of the farmers are small and middle farmers, who are 95% of farmers in the US belong to that category, but they only receive 25% of the total value chain. Farm suicides are 4 to 5 times more than the national average suicide rate in the US. And what he is going to talk about is how he felt when he was touring the whole country. And with him, he will be joined by 2 young physicists, one doing PhD in Caltech, California Technological Institute, and other, she is doing a PhD in NIST. And I will be just moderating the discussion. They will be talking mostly about the US farms and how corporate agricultural businesses destroyed small and middle farmers in the US. After Reagan and Clinton passed farm reforms and opened up the markets in 1980s and 1990s, similar kinds of laws are being introduced in India right now, and millions of farmers are protesting those laws. I have visited some of those sites personally, so I will also be telling you about my experiences and whether there are similar dynamics happening and how monopoly capitalism around the world is changing the nature of agriculture throughout the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Amit. So next week, we'll be having that presentation. The following week, on the 27th, we have a special guest, special presenter, Norman Finkelstein, who is a internationally known Middle East scholar, the son of two Holocaust survivors, and a champion for the Palestinian people, is going to be speaking about current events in Gaza, and that will be on the 27th at 10:30. We hope all of you will be able to make it then. Before we go to the Q&A, I'd like to ask people to please, Richard Fallenbaum, if you would make a quick announcement about fundraising for our activities. Appreciate it. Richard?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Yes, I want to talk a little bit about the need for funds. We continue to need funds for the Institute for the Critical Study of Society and for the Niebel Proctor Library, which is our spiritual and physical home in Oakland, California. We have relatively modest needs, but we do definitely have needs. I've posted on the website, on the chat, how you can contribute easily through the various methods. If you missed that, it is also in the email announcing the meeting. If you scroll down, you can see the same details there. So I hope you can contribute and contribute generously. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so let's shift over to opening up for discussion. And the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to call on people who have their hands raised in the participants window. And you'll have 2 minutes to raise your question, make your comments. We'll take one question at a time. That's generally the way we do it. And Roger, you'll get a chance to respond. And I think I'm going to start off with Sharon, who was our introducer for today's program. Sharon, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I just want to make a comment about the way racism historically was used to slow down the organization of auto workers. So you may know that Henry Ford consciously went about splitting his workers along racial lines, and he understood that as long as black and white workers were antagonistic to each other, it would help him. There's a town called Inkster, which is to the west of Detroit, which was built by Henry Ford. It was his version of a joke, where he had his black workers have the opportunity to live when they couldn't live in other, large number of neighborhoods inside Detroit. And you may know, or it's an interesting fact, that the local at the River Rouge plant is number 600, local 600 of the UAW. And why is that? When a lot of the locals in Chevrolet and Chrysler are lower numbers, because that's how long it took to overcome the racism and get a union local at River Rouge. And I think it's important for us to understand that to this day, a lot of union organizing is slowed down and interrupted by racism and by the conscious use of racism by the bosses. That's all I wanted to say.
Roger, comment?
Good point. Good point. Absolutely. The only thing I would add is kind of just to elaborate on the point I made before, which is that in the context of the time, it was a little more. I mean, I agree. What you said is absolutely true, but Ford was hiring black workers, and which again, and giving money to black churches and building these black neighborhoods. So he was a very clever guy, and so this is why I think Ford was the last place to organize. Not only because he divided the workers, but then he had this very clever way of ingratiating himself into the African American community by doling out certain favors and etc. So it made things very, very difficult to organize. But I agree entirely with your point.
Okay, next up, I'm going to ask Anne to unmute yourself and bring up your question, followed by Aaron after that.
So thank you so much for the great talk. I just kept thinking of a parallel struggle in Texas led by Emetanayuka, Yucapawa, which was a CIA union, and 10,000 pecan shellers in San Antonio. And the reason, and the parallels are just one after another, after another, after another to what you described. And the reason I kept thinking about this, other than knowing more about this, was that so frequently we hear that the reason that things like the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, the failure there, is because it's in the South, or because times have changed, or because there's less power within the UAW, and so forth and so on. And yet, I'm not sure those excuses are right. And I'm wondering, since your point is that it's the communist influence that made the difference in the 30s, whether that is still the case and what can be done about it.
Well, I think it's still the case in the sense that it goes back to me to the ABCs. How can you have a successful class struggles, even successful struggles to build unions, if you don't have leaders out there who understand the reality, who don't understand the basic reality of class conflict and class struggle and unity and the importance of discipline, the importance of being a vanguard, taking a leadership role, the importance of
raise your hand.
Centralization, etc. That you need a force like that, it seems to me, to be successful. And
that's the only thing I could say.
That spontaneous struggles in themselves
I'm sorry, you're muted, Roger.
Sorry. Yeah. So without that sense of theory, of leadership, of organization that communists provide, either has to be by them or by somebody else who plays that role, that relying on spontaneity itself just ends up running struggles into the ground. I think a good example of that was in our own lifetime of the Occupy Wall Street, which was a wonderful spontaneous movement, but was eventually taken over by anarchists and led to nothing. Maybe it affected people's consciousness somewhat in the long run, which is not a bad thing. But it seems to me that the lesson is, though, precisely what you point out. You need a communist or somebody who plays that role of that the Communist Party played to lead, organized, successful struggles.
Okay, next is Aaron, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, followed by Goulden, followed by Jean, and then Richard W. Aaron?
Hi, thank you so much, Roger, for coming here to speak today. My name's Aaron. I am a member in the Stagehands Union, IATSE 107 here in Oakland. I'm also a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, co-chair of the local chapter's labor committee. And, you had mentioned when you were kicking off your talk that the part of the impetus for getting the book republished was that there was a new generation of socialists or radicals coming up. I'm one of those. I've been in the labor movement now for 6 years, been part of DSA for 4. And, a lot of the questions about organization and orientation and all of this sort of stuff are coming up again. DSA is, it's not a cadre organization. We have 90,000 members or so. So there's lots of particular challenges, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think some lessons are from your book for socialists and socialist unionists today, I should say, for what a productive orientation and organization is, things that folks should take away.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Good question. That makes me think. Well, I think one thing, just to go beyond, what I've already said, just not to repeat myself here, but I think one thing that is important to realize, which I've not mentioned so far, is that it goes really back to what Marx said at the end of the manifesto, that socialist revolutionaries, that communists have to fight for the immediate needs of the workers, but also have to raise the long-term goal, namely socialism. And I think that I didn't discuss this too much, but that the communists in the industry did that. And it takes courage, and it takes intelligence, and it takes sophistication to do that. Because, for example, in the 1920s, the AWU and the communists, almost invariably, one of the planks of their platform would be recognize the Soviet Union. Well, why in the hell raise the Soviet Union question when you're trying to organize auto workers? Isn't that just being provocative? Aren't you shooting yourself in the foot? Yeah, just keep it on wages and hours. That's what you might think. But actually, it was a way in which communists set themselves away from the AFL. The AFL, by the way, they didn't have any problems about raising these political issues. They said, don't recognize the Soviet Union. That was their position. When the Depression occurred, they blamed it on the Soviet Union, not on the capitalists, on the Soviet Union. Soviet dumping. That's why it caused the Depression. So in other words, it's the communists weren't raising this support of the Soviet Union out of the blue or out of some kind of strange dogmatism and sectarianism. It was a way to separate themselves from the AFL and the ideology of the AFL. And I think workers were smart enough to see this, and it was an important thing. The same with racism. There was an extreme reluctance to raise these racial issues. I mean, a tremendous number of auto workers in the 1920s and 1930s were from the South, fresh from the South. They came up during the war because there was employment, or they were from Eastern Europe, and they brought a lot of prejudices with them from Eastern Europe. It would have been so much easier just to finesse this racial question, not bring it up at all, but the communists did the exact opposite. They confronted it, and in the long run, I think they were absolutely right. And they, by the way, recruited some very capable African American workers because of this. So I guess what I'm saying. I mean, I think the obvious lessons of what I talked about, the need for organization, the need to take a class struggle rather than a class cooperation approach. I think all of those are key. But I think another lesson here is the importance of taking some of these difficult stands that may not seem immediately practical and necessary, but are principled and in the long run important. I think that's a lesson I would take from this experience of the 1930s and 40s.
Okay, next is Gulden. If you would unmute yourself, followed by Jean, and then Richard W. Gulden.
Thank you so much, Roger, for your presentation, and it was very informative. You pretty much answered my question on the previously, but I'm just going to go ahead and in Turkey, for example, this socialist labor union leader, his name is Kemal Türkler. He founded the Turkey Confederation of Revolutionary Trade Unions in Turkey in 1963. At the same time, he also founded the Workers' Party of Turkey. So it was realized that communists should lead the unions in Turkey. So this union was not influenced by communists, but actually led by communists. And he was assassinated in 1980, of course, because of his communist activities. But actually, you answered some of the questions, but why this wasn't the case in the United States? I mean, communists actually strong enough at that time, Communist Party was strong enough at that time to form its own union. Thank you very much.
Well, I guess, I mean, of course, in the late 1920s and early 30s, the communists in many industries did form their own unions because, well, starting in the mine workers and the garment industry, they were thrown out. They were thrown out. You could not be a communist and be a member of the United Mine Workers Union. And this was true in many places. And so the communists began forming their own unions. So it did happen. But I think what you point to is something else, which is obvious, but which we should all keep in mind, which the circumstances for communists, socialists in the US is different than probably in any other country. That is, anti-communism historically has been greater in this country than in any other country in the world short of fascism, like in Germany or Spain or Italy. And what this meant is that in the labor movement, communists had to work in a situation where they were never kind of granted full citizenship. You could never operate as a open communist in the U.S. labor movement. And there were a few exceptions. There were a few individuals who did proclaim themselves open communists. But these were very exceptional circumstances. For the most part, people who were communists had to keep their mouths shut about it. That is, Alain Decaux, who was extremely close to the Communist Party, it was top echelons of the CIO, said there was an unspoken rule, in the CIO. This was true in the UAW as well, you could work with communists as long as communists kept their mouths shut about it. As long as, you know, there could be this tacit agreement that you wouldn't throw it in our faces. That agreement worked until the Cold War, and then even that didn't hold up. But it meant that the communists in this country worked under limitations and constraints that were really unknown elsewhere in the world. Again, I say, short of open fascism, that they managed to have the influence they did is a tribute to their character, to their bravery, to their secrecy, whatever, you know, and to their diplomacy, that they were able to work with and get along with people who, if they had known they were communists, wouldn't have worked with them. So that's also a lesson, I think, to be drawn from this experience.
Okay, next is Jean, followed by Richard, followed by Amit, and then Carol, I understand that you have your hand up. I have you on the stack, so.
Yes. Okay.
So go ahead, Jean.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Roger, for this. I have to confess that I got goosebumps when you were talking about the great sit-down strike of 1936. It's really been a very dynamic and important history. So thank you for covering all this. My question has to do with going back a ways in U.S. labor history to I think the first industrial union was the IWW. And if you look at the preamble to the Constitution, the IWW back in 1905, that's almost straight out of Marx. You know, these horrible conditions will continue until the workers organize as a class and abolish the wage system. So it's just straight from Marx. So I just would like to have your comments, what you think about the connection between the IWW and the later CIO movement, because I know many of the IWW didn't disappear. For the most part, they just moved into the Communist Party very highly. So I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, I think your last point is very well taken. Originally, when I started this work, I was originally just going to talk about the left, the role of the left in building the UAW. I mean, I'm from Michigan. I went to school in Detroit. My father worked for General Motors. I had 3 stepbrothers who spent their life working for General Motors. And I worked for General Motors 3 summers while I was going to school myself. So, and I became active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in Detroit. So I was kind of, you know, interested in the connection between the left and auto, you know, kind of reflecting my background. Where was I going with this? So I'm sorry, let's see. The IWW. The IWW. So I was originally looking at the role of the left. And there were some IWW people still around and trying to organize auto. In the late 1920s, a guy named Frank Cedarvall was from the IWW. But what I discovered, there were socialists around. There were the Proletarian Party. There was the Socialist Party, Socialist Workers Party, etc. But what I discovered is that when you talk about the left in auto in 1920s and 1930s, you're talking about the Communist Party. Basically, everybody else was irrelevant. As one Trotskyist even told me, look at, in the 1930s, you have to understand, in auto, basically what we were doing is handing out leaflets, communists called demonstrations. You know? But the point is, I think with the IWW is that I think the IWW played an important role at its time, and important people came out of the IWW, like Big Bill Haywood, who became a communist, and even Foster was, before he formed his own North American Syndicalist League, had been with the IWW. But of course, the difference, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, is that with the Russian Revolution, it was a wake-up call to many people who were syndicalists like the IWW, because the revolution in Russia did not come the way syndicalists expected it to come, thought it would come. It did not come through unions, did not come through a general strike. It came through a political party that seized political power. So many people drew the lesson of that Russian Revolution, that this is the way you get to where we're going. This is the way you get to what Marx wanted, not through syndicalist anti-political approach, but through political parties and political action, as well as through unions. So I think this is what brought many people like Foster, like Haywood, into the communist movement. And so, in that sense, again, I'm just elaborating and agreeing with what you implied.
Thank you.
Okay, next is Richard, followed by Amit, followed by Carol. Richard, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Unfortunately, Gene has sort of preempted one of my questions. And you saw, and sort of echoing what you were just talking about. I grew up on New England, in the industrial New England, and ended up on the West Coast in Eugene, Oregon, finishing up my degree program, where I got exposed to the IWW. And my question is this: is that so far you focused on the hammer, if you will, of the hammer and sickle. Are there any CP struggles in the sickle, in the agricultural area? The reason I mentioned the IWW because, of course, they were doing the timber industry up in Pacific Northwest.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just wondering if you could broaden out the organizing perspectives in agriculture. Thank you.
Yes, well, thanks for that. It's not my forte, but one of my old colleagues was a historian named Cletus Daniel, and he wrote a book on the organization of agricultural workers in California in the 1930s and the role that communists played in that. And so there was a role. Also, there's Robin Kelly's book called Hammer and Hoe on the activity of communists among agricultural workers and other workers in Alabama. And recently I've been editing volume 12 of Philip Foner's history of the United States labor movement, which he died before finishing. And this deals with the period of the Depression, 1929 to 1933. And the communists, as he describes, were very active in several agricultural areas in Florida and Colorado and California. So even though it's not my expertise, there certainly was activity there. Thank you.
Okay. Next up is Amit, followed by Carol. And if others have questions, now's the time to raise your hand. The reactions button at the bottom of the screen or on your participants window. So we welcome questions. So Amit, if you would unmute yourself and ask your
comments.
Comments are fine too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. Actually, my question is a little bit involved with dialectics. So, Professor Keeran talked about the role of the communists and probably the Communist Party also in sustaining the labor movement throughout the US. So this is like a one-way analysis, in my opinion. In the sense that there is a there are communists and Communist Party trying to energize the workers. But the other side is a little bit, I feel, missing here. What about the economic and social conditions and the workers themselves who will become communists and who will try to influence the Communist Party? So, so my question basically deals with the other side of the question. It has to be dealt with the kind of technological changes that are happening in the society, the kind of larger changes, for example, changes in the race relations that we talked about in a great detail. So these days, if you look at the politics around the world, a lot of politics is involved with race issue, gender issue, and identity-based issues, including some sort of, transgender-based issues. So the question which arises here is that, are we at a juncture where labor has taken a little bit a back seat in terms of the class, but more in terms of non-class based, but still progressive alliances. And it will, unless it will complete its own phase, the next cycle of the labor struggle will not happen. And we have to just watch the unfolding scenario and prepare ourselves better so that the new wave of the labor struggles will propel the class politics. So something on the sense of dialectics, what Professor Keeran thinks about, I would be interested in knowing.
Could you repeat that last part again? You kind of faded out there a little bit.
I'm sorry. I was just saying that rather than the class-based issues emerging on the foreground, there are objective conditions working on the backside. But you can see that more and more politics is happening on the race issues, identity-based issues, gender-based issues. So do we think that this is just a phase of history which will play its dynamics out, and for that we need to wait and watch and prepare ourselves so that the next wave of the labor struggle will propel us into a better class politics?
Well, I'm a historian and I'm a very terrible prognosticator. Politically, all of my prognostications are wrong. Historically, it seems to me, I always am too optimistic or too pessimistic or something. But in any case, let me kind of, without trying to give a definitive answer to your question, where things are going and where we should go, let me just give a reaction. So that is, when I see all of this identity politics occurring these days, the thought that occurs to me is absolutely, this should be happening. The communists were the first to raise identity politics. They were the first to oppose using the N-word. They were the first to oppose films that glorified the South and slavery, etc. They were the first to fight this kind of to raise a kind of political correctness, but the communists who first raised this, and particularly in the late 1920s and 1930s, they would not recognize what's going on today, because they always raised this identity politics and gender politics within the context of class struggle, not in place of class struggle. And it seems to me that increasingly that's what we see, because let's face it, as right and correct and as it is and necessary to struggle against the kind of discrimination experienced by blacks and minorities and women and transgender, as right as that is, it's not going to change capitalism, right? It does not threaten private property. That's the essence. And so you can see all of these high-tech companies, embracing diversity and putting diversity officers in place, firing people who don't treat women right, etc. Well, fine, good for them, but it's not going to change the system. And, which is why these corporations are, seems to me, much more willing to embrace identity politics than let's say raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, So I think, we just have to keep that in mind that, let's face it, we're living in a period where economic inequality is greater than it's ever been in this country. Where you look at the New York Times today or the day before, the billionaires, Bezos and the others, pay no taxes at all on their billions of dollars of profits. Income inequality, which really, when income inequality is greater than it's ever been, what does that really mean? Exploitation is greater than it's ever been. The workers are being screwed over and their wealth taken away in a greater proportion than ever. And yet, who's raising this? Where is this being raised in the mass media? Where is that? Where is the grassroots movements raising? Where's the political party that's raising this? Not coming from the Democrats, except in very, very faint ways, and certainly not the Republicans. So this is what's most striking to me at a time when exploitation and economic inequality is greater than ever, when the political power exercised by the corporations is greater than ever, that we're focusing on identity politics, and I find that perplexing. I find it disheartening. Thank you.
Okay, Carol, thank you for your patience. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, you mentioned UAW's involvement with GM and Ford, especially in the 30s. What has been their involvement with Chrysler?
Yeah, I didn't mean to exclude Chrysler. I would just say, those were the big three. Chrysler was organized right after General Motors and before Ford. So as well as, all of these smaller parts places, Briggs and Kelsey Wheel and et cetera. So I think Ford was the last major holdout in the auto industry, 1941.
Okay, next is Yusuf, if you would unmute yourself. Yusuf.
Yes, thank you. No, I just wanted to make a comment on Gülden. I don't think it's actually desirable to form a separate union unless you really have to, and you could really make a difference. That's in the case of DISC in Turkey. This carried a substantial portion of the working class and was a source of inspiration for militant unionism. But if you can't pull it out in a good effectively, I don't think it's desirable if we form a separate union and serve a last resort. And I would like a comment on that.
Yes, I agree. I mean, that was the communist position as well in the 1920s and 1930s, as different, let's say, from the IWW. The IWW thought actually it was the way to go to form independent unions outside the AFL. The AFL was hopelessly reactionary. That wasn't the Communist Party position. In fact, I mean, they began with an organization called the Trade Union Education League. And the idea was to work inside the AFL to win people over to the idea of industrial unionism and class struggle unionism and racial equality, sexual equality, etc. But by the late 1920s, the reactionaries of the AFL were driving them out. They, again, and the mine workers, even John L. Lewis drove out the communists, and the amalgamated clothing workers, Sidney Hillman, and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, David Dubinsky. They wouldn't allow communists to operate. They ferreted them out. And so in this situation, the communists began to organize independent unions. But as soon as there was a chance to get back into the mainstream unions, these federal labor unions in 1934 and 35, the communists took advantage of it. Again, that's Wyndham Mortimer's story. So I think there's no disagreement there. You can't separate yourself off from other workers for simple ideological reasons. You got to try to get in there and mix it up and struggle. And that's what the communist viewpoint was when they could do it. Thank you.
I had a question for you, Roger. You very clearly presented the role of the Communist Party at the heart of the labor movement, the organizing, the unions. But we know from history that it wasn't long after that, within a decade or so, that the communists were driven out during the Cold War and the McCarthy period. Could you comment on, was there really any lesson that could be learned from what took place, how that might have been prevented? Anything that the Communist Party could have done to, even though they organized these unions and played such an important role historically, to be pushed aside?
Well, again, that's an excellent question. It's one that I posed to myself in writing this book, and I think the answer comes through the latter part of the book. It's I think particularly when you're a communist, you're a Marxist, you're particularly interested in this question. That is not only seeing what you did right, but what you might have done wrong. Did we make mistakes? How could we have done this differently? Is there anything we could have done? My honest evaluation of the situation, again, I'd have to go into some of the details of what was transpiring in auto and labor in general in 1946 and 1947. But there was very little that the communists could have done differently. It was like being hit by a truck, I mean, for example, one lesson that people tend to draw is, well, the communists should have, they should have changed their name from communists. They should have called themselves something else because anti-communism was so strong. They should have called themselves, something else. Or they shouldn't have supported the Soviet Union. If they just would, that was their vulnerability. They just should have, stuck with American conditions and not tried to defend the Soviet Union, etc. Well, frankly, I don't think either of those things would have worked. And it's the classic opportunist thinking. It's like we're going to give up our principles here to make some gains in the short run. And our principles are, we support socialism. The Soviet Union is the leading wedge of socialism now in 1946, and we're going to support it. And if we don't support it, then we're just being opportunists, right? What principles are we going to stick by? So I think, first of all, I don't think it would have worked. that is, the anti-communist campaign was so strong. No fooling around the edges would have made that much difference. And plus, again, it would have compromised basic principles. So it not only wouldn't have worked, but it would have been counterproductive, I think, in the long run. So let me just give an example of it seems to me what one of the crucial moments in the Cold War and McCarthyism occurred in Milwaukee, 1946, 1947. The Alice Chalmers Company, the workers there went on strike at Alice Chalmers, Local 248, the United Automobile Workers Union. Alice Chalmers was a big, maybe the largest producer of agricultural and heavy industry equipment. The head of Alice Chalmers was a crypto-fascist. He was basically supported fascism in Germany in the 1930s. A very extremely reactionary company. And it was led by a communist, really, Harold Christoffel, who I interviewed once, a wonderful guy. So they led the strike in 1946. There were many strikes in 1946 to catch up with the inflation that occurred during the war. In this strike, they faced a wall of anti-communist opposition. Every day for about 3 months during the strike, the Milwaukee Sentinel, the leading paper in Milwaukee, ran a front page story on basically Milwaukee under Stalin, linking the Union with Stalin. Then you had the opposition of the company, of course. Then you had the Labor Committee and the HUAC, House Un-American Activities Committee, held hearings in Milwaukee during the strike. And the point of these hearings was to identify these leaders of the strike as communist. And then they called the leaders of the strike, including Harold Christoffel, and asked him if he was a communist. And he said, no, he wasn't. And then the union itself had just elected Walter Reuther as president, and he was elected president on the basis of his anti-communism, basically. So he started attacking. So here's a union on strike, being attacked back by the company, by the press, by the government, and now by its own union. How could they possibly win in that situation? They're going to change their name. Even, like I say, Christoffel denied that he was a communist. It didn't make any difference. They put him on trial. They found some old communist petitions for governor of Wisconsin that Christoffel had signed. And so they put him on trial for perjury and sent him to prison for 5 years. What could Christoffel have done any different? It makes you what? I don't think there was any obvious mistakes that the communists made that they could have somehow avoided or blunted this anti-communist repression. I'm sorry to say, but still, it's a good question. It's worth thinking about. And let me just add. I mean, if there was one mistake that might have helped, but even that, I don't think it would have blunted it completely. It was after the union got sick and tired of this Homer Martin, who was the president, and they threw him out and decided to elect a new leader. The obvious choice was Wyndham Mortimer, or a close associate of Mortimer's, a guy named George Addis, who wasn't a communist, but was a good, solid progressive. But instead of this, they decided to go with this mainstream, cigar smoking, hail Phil Met guy, R.J. Thomas. Not a bad guy, but no politics at all. And because because there'd been so much red baiting in the Union. I think they thought that this was just going to divide the Union to put run Mortimer for president. It's just going to open the Union up to more red baiting. So Mortimer, stepped aside. Now, I think if Mortimer would have won, or if Addis would have run, they would have won. They were so popular. And maybe having Mortimer or Addis as president instead of Walter Reuther might have helped blunt this. Because after all, Walter Reuther was the first one to support the Taft-Hartley affidavits, and the way he attacked Alice Chalmers was shameless. That wouldn't have happened if Mortimer or Addis had been president. But in the long run, I think the truck bearing down on them was just too big and too speedy, and they couldn't have ducked out of the way. That's my impression anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, Gene, if you would go ahead, and then we'll wrap up this part of the program. Gene.
Unmute myself. Yeah, well, this has been great. I really appreciate all of the discussion here. But one thing that I did react to, and it has to do with the Democratic Party and the widespread view that there's nothing good can come out of the Democratic Party. And I've been a Bernie supporter. I voted for Bernie in 2016, and whenever I could. Vote for Bernie, and anything that is and Bernie's strategy was to take what's been called the primary route, to run in the Democratic Party, because that's the only way you're going to get any coverage. So, and it seems like it's been successful. I mean, Bernie was the first person to say the Palestinians are our friends too. He's the first person that said that. Now we have Rashida there in Congress. And then also he's always said it's the 1%. He has not a real good, strong Marxist analysis, but at least he raises the issue. So I just would like to have your comments on that. I would appreciate that.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think the Bernie phenomenon is one of the most encouraging things that's happened, and that and AOC and the rest of them in Congress, it's encouraging for in mainstream politics. And I think it reminds me that, in the 1930s and even me today, I mean, I support independent politics too. I mean, I think that in the long run, you've got to break away from the Democratic and Republican parties, that workers need their own party, etc. But, and the communists held that position in the 1930s, and but it didn't, they held it, but not dogmatically. Unlike, others on the left who insisted that they run their own people against Roosevelt and oppose the Democrats and then the New Deal. The party ran its own candidates, but mainly to attack the Republicans and not to try to do in Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I think we need that kind of flexibility. I think we have to keep alive this idea of independent political action, that the Democratic Party is going to break our hearts and disappoint us and support the capitalists. But hey, we can't be blind to the fact of this phenomenon of Bernie and AOC and the congressman from Minnesota and the one of Rashid and the one from Detroit, et cetera. These are important developments. These are straws in the wind that we've got to watch and support. So support independent action, yes, but not, dogmatically.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's pretty much wraps up this part of the program. I think we can stop the recording now.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, at yahoo.com. And the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.